Hey guys, and welcome to Graphic Designer Pro. In this video, we're going to be taking you through how to convert raster images into vector designs in Adobe Illustrator 2021. Now there are a few different techniques to doing this, and it really depends on the style of design that you're going to be creating. But we'll be running through some of the best techniques to use to create professional vector artwork. You can also download a free template file from the description below that you can use to follow along with this tutorial. Remember to like the video if you enjoy it, and subscribe for more weekly design content. Okay, let's head onto the computer now and get started. Okay, so here we are in our template file in Adobe Illustrator 2021. Now, as I say, you can download this exact same template file from the description below, so you'll have everything that we're going to be looking at in this tutorial. Now, starting over on the left-hand side, we have a few images already set up, ready to go. You can simply drag and drop images into your Illustrator files, and they'll be good to go for converting to vector. So starting with this image on the left-hand side, the first technique we're going to be looking at is the good old image trace feature in Adobe Illustrator. Anyone who's been using Illustrator for a bit of time now will probably know about this. It's such a fast and easy way of converting a raster image into a vector graphic. And it can be very tempting just to use this all the time if you're ever wanting to do something like this, but for creating usable professional designs, it really has quite limited use. It's not always going to give you very accurate results, and more often than not, they need a lot of tidying up afterwards. We are going to look at some instances where it can be very useful though, and we'll also look at some other techniques as well. So in this example, we have this retro Bugatti logo, really nice, and in this case, I want to just vectorize just the text element of this, so just the word Bugatti, and really everything else I'm going to get rid of. So before using the image trace feature, I would always recommend cropping your image to only the area that you actually want to vectorize. If it is the whole image, then that's fine, but by doing this, it's going to remove any unnecessary stress on your computer when it comes to actually converting this, especially with high resolution imagery like we have here. It can take a little bit of time to convert. And on that note, only ever use high resolution images when you're using the image trace feature. It simply does not do a good enough job when it comes to low res images, and you'll really be wasting your time if you try it. We'll show you some examples later on, but in this case, I'm going to select my image. I'm going to go over to my properties panel. If you don't have this set up, you can simply go up to window and then down to properties, and in the properties panel you'll then get some quick actions with your image selected. So this is very useful, and you can basically use these quick actions instead of opening specific panels up. So in this case I want to click crop image, and it's automatically going to give me some crop handles, and I can basically just resize this box to fit around the text here. So I'm going to try and make this as small as possible around the text so that I'm not including any unnecessary areas of the image, which is just going to slow the process down. So I'll go with something like that. That should do. And back over my properties panel, I'm just going to click apply. This has been cropped now. And going back to my quick actions, I also have an option now for image trace. So I can simply click this. I can also open up the image trace panel again by going up to window and then down to image trace. So this actually opens up the full image trace dialog box, and we're not going to go into all the details of the image trace feature. If you'd like to know more about all of the sliders and how it works more specifically, let us know in the comments and we'll do a separate video on that. But really we're looking at this as more of an overview in this video. So from the top we have a preset drop down, and this has a bunch of different profiles that we can select from depending on the image and the output we're going for. So in this case I want to create really quite a simple vector, only really using 3 colors. So I only want the white, the black and the red color in behind. So immediately the 3 colors preset could be a good option. It's not guaranteed that it's going to use those colors. If there are other colors in your image, it could pick 3 other colors, for example. My other option would be to use the high fidelity photo, and that's going to retain the most amount of detail from the image. In this case though, let's go with 3 colors and see how this works. So that was fairly quick to act there because we cropped the image down, and if I zoom in, this has actually done quite a good job for the look I'm going for. So in this case, case, I actually want something that looks quite rough and eroded, so this is actually working quite well. If I wanted a much cleaner look, obviously this isn't really going to do a good enough job. I do have some advanced options here, so I can adjust things like the paths and corners. It doesn't make a huge difference, so I'm just going to go over to my quick actions and click expand, and that's actually going to convert it into paths as we see here. Now I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit more. Firstly, I'm just going to grab my rectangle tool and I'm just going to click and drag out a rectangle over this. I'm going to right click it, go down to arrange and then send to back, and then I'm going to press I on my keyboard and that's going to enable my eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to click on the red area to match that red rusty color. Now from here I just want to get rid of any of the elements that I don't want that have been traced. It all gets grouped after the image trace has been applied, which is actually quite useful because I can just double click into here and then just simply go through deleting the sections that I don't want, and luckily in this case there's not that many of them, so it's fairly easy. And if I double click out, this is what we're left with, and I actually quite like the result I've got here. It's very rough and ready, but for the type of look I'm going for, this actually works well. All I'm going to do now is center it against the rectangle that we've created, and I'll slightly rotate it, and that's what we're left with. I quite like that. I think that's a pretty good use of the image trace feature. Let's move on though, and we've got another image here. Again, another very high resolution image, lots of detail in the leaf itself, but the fact that it's on a white background is really going to help when it comes to using this feature. So this is another example of where you might use it. If you've got an image like this that you're wanting to, say, use this leaf shape in a design, but in a much more simplified way, this is where it can be useful. So again, if I go over to my image trace button in the quick actions, if I click it, we automatically get the presets drop down and we can select from one of these. Now if I was to select high fidelity photo, we're going to get a warning to say that this is a large image and it's going to proceed slowly. So there's a perfect example. You don't want crazy detailed images, otherwise it is going to struggle a bit. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK though. Hopefully this one won't take too long because it's not as complex as some other photos. But bear in mind, I'm using an iMac Pro. This is a very powerful computer and even it is still taking a bit of time with this. If you're on an old laptop or something, it's really going to struggle with some of these high resolution images. Now that's it done with the high fidelity photo profile. If I zoom right in, you can see it's creating tons and tons of vector shapes to make up this leaf. Now that's fine, but it's really way too detailed for something like a vector design. You may as well just keep this as an image unless you want to scale it up to a huge size really, and even then you're probably going to see the fact that it's a vector image and not just a raster image. So you have to ask yourself the reason for actually converting it to a vector in the first place. So for something like this, I'm really just looking at the silhouette of this leaf. So we could actually change the preset, and another one that I like to use is the black and white logo option. So I'm going to select that and you'll see it's changing. It's now just black and white and we've got the general shape of the leaf, although we still have quite a lot of detail in some areas of this. So we want to try and get rid of that. So let's open up our image trace dialog box again, and the only slider I'm going to look at here is the threshold. So if I pull the threshold to the left, that's essentially going to bring in more of the highlights, so we're losing the darker areas, and that's the opposite of what we want in this case. Let's go over to the right hand side and that's going to bring in more of the darks of the image. Let's keep going, and now we're left with a pretty good silhouette of this leaf. What I can also do is click this ignore white checkbox down at the bottom, and that's simply going to remove any white areas so that we're just left with the leaf shape itself. So I can go ahead and click expand, and as you can see we have this simple leaf shape. I can go and recolor this now and use it in my designs how I want. So that's a pretty useful example of the image trace feature and something that we can use it for and save a lot of time with. Now even with that, there's still a bit of a drawback, and we'll cover that in this next example. So we have two of the same image here, but one is very low resolution and the other is very high resolution, and this is just an example of the difference in how well it works with these two images. So let's start with the high resolution image, and this is another example of where you might use it. Say you see some nice typography out and about and you want to try and recreate that in a design and vectorize it. This is where you might use the image trace feature. So we've got this neon text here. Let's go over to our image trace quick action, and this time I'm going to go straight to black and white logo again. We're going to get this warning message again, but I'm just going to click OK and persevere. This one was much quicker to work, and right from the off this is doing quite a nice job. However, we can go and fine tune this a little bit more. Using our threshold, if I pull this over to the right, it should get rid of some of the extra details that we don't want. I'll continue to do this, and I think that's looking pretty good now. So I'm just going to go ahead and click expand, and we have a pretty solid vector design. I could go and delete the black box in behind and change the color of this, but for the time being, let's just move on to the example on the right hand side. So it seems to me that this is the much more likely scenario where you have an image like this that you want to try and trace, and as you'll see here, let's do the exact same thing. Let's go to image trace and then black and white logo. It's simply not doing anywhere near as good a job. This is completely unusable. Let's go into our image trace options. I can even adjust the threshold. It's not going to help. There's just not enough detail in that image, and there's no amount of playing around with these settings that's going to change that. So what I'm going to do is go back up to object, down to image trace, and then release, just to release those settings. So we're back to what we started with. So in this situation, this is where we would have to use the tools at our disposal in Illustrator to trace this. And this is still my #1 recommendation if you're wanting to create truly professional designs from raster images. It's going to be a longer process, but there are a lot of benefits to it. So for a start, let's go back to the image trace that we've just carried out. I'm just going to select this, and if I switch to my outline view by pressing Command Y or Control Y, you can see just how many points have been created to build up this vector. So this is a huge drawback of the image trace feature. It's going to create tons of anchor points, and there's not much you can do about that. If I go over to the leaf shape that we created, this is the exact same. Look at all those anchor points. It's an insane amount, and it's just a byproduct of using this feature. Same with our Bugatti text here as well. It really is a lot, and you may think, oh, that's not that bad. We've still got our vector image, but if you ever want to edit this, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. It's not best practice when we're creating vector designs, and it's actually going to make your file size a lot larger as well. So in an example like this where we have this script-like text, another thing you might want to do is actually create single paths with a stroke on it instead, and again there are some benefits to that which we'll cover afterwards. So what I can do is just trace over this image instead with a tool of my choosing. So what I'm going to do is go over to my layers. Let's lock this images layer. Another thing we can do that can be quite useful depending on what we're doing is I can double click on this layer and click this template checkbox, and what that's going to do is dim the images, and we can specify to what percentage. If I click OK, that's just going to dim it, and it can make this slightly easier to trace depending on what the image is. In this case, it's actually probably easier if I just leave this at full opacity, and I can create a new layer. And really for something like this, there are only two tools that I would ever consider using. The first one being the pen tool, and I know there's probably a lot of you watching this that hate using the pen tool, and that's why you would always go to something like the image trace feature. However, there are some really useful techniques to using this that make it actually very easy to use. We don't have time to cover them in this video, but if you're interested in these techniques, let us know in the comments down below, and we will create a video dedicated to pen tool techniques in the future, and that will hopefully really help you. But with our image layer locked here, I can simply start tracing over this. I would need to make sure I've actually got a stroke set. I'm going to give this curved corners and caps, and we'll bump the stroke weight up a bit as well. I might have to adjust this as I go, but I can simply plot points, click and drag, and just match the flow of these paths as I go along. I'm not being too precise here, but you can see how easy this is to do already. Another tool that you could use for something like this, because we have a lot of curved areas, is the curvature tool. So it sits right next to the pen tool, and if I select it, it works slightly differently. There's no clicking and dragging involved. I'm just going to get off that path. We'll go over to the letter T here, but I can simply click once. That's going to plot an anchor point, and what we want to do is click in the middle of every curved area. So if I click again, it's going to create a straight line, but you can see on my preview line that this is actually creating a curved line here. If I want to create a sharp corner, I can simply double click. So we've got our curved area, and now I can do the same down here. So I can click once in the middle of this curve, go down to the bottom and click again, and we've got another curved area. We could continue this right down to the bottom, and this can be a slightly easier way to trace something like this if you don't like using the pen tool. However, you will end up creating more anchor points, and it can take a little bit of getting used to as well. So our preference would probably be the pen tool, but this really comes down to personal preference. I'm actually just going to delete these for now, and we've actually already created a trace of this text, which I'm just going to enable with the top layer. layer called Trace Example. So you can see what we've done here. This is simply tracing this exact image, and what I'm going to do is just turn off our images layer. So this is what we're left with. This is a pretty good representation of what we were looking at, but even better than that, if I press Command Y or Control Y again, let's just click and drag over all of this text and look how few anchor points we've had to use to create this. So we did this all with the pen tool, and this is a much more simplified design. It's much easier to now go and edit if I wanted to adjust any of these letters or create more. This is really what you want to be striving for when you're creating vector designs. I'm going to flip back now, press Command Y again, and the other benefit of this in this example specifically is that we've created this with paths and applied strokes to it. So we now actually have the option to go and adjust those strokes. So I could drop down my brush definition drop down, for example, and we could select a calligraphy brush, for example, and that's going to change the look of it. We could apply something with more texture to it, and really we've just got way more control over this than we would if it was just the usual image trace outline. Let's enable our images again. We'll go back over to our previous image trace. This has so many anchor points that if I wanted to adjust anything on here, it's just going to be an absolute nightmare. Now you can use things like the simplify feature in Adobe Illustrator, but even that doesn't do a very good job most of the time. It tends to alter the paths quite heavily, and you're going to end up having to manually adjust it anyway. So I would highly recommend getting used to tracing with the pen or curvature tools for creating much more simplified professional designs. Let's keep moving on though, and we have another example of where the image trace feature may be useful, and that's for vectorizing rough sketches. So this is maybe something that you'll do if you're designing something like a logo, or certainly at the concept stage of design projects where you want to create maybe a hand-drawn looking graphic. So I've got a simple image here. These are very rough sketches that I've created, and you can see the image quality isn't particularly high as well. It's quite soft around the edges, but I can still use my image trace feature. So let's go back to properties, image trace, and again just going straight to the black and white logo preset. That's going to work perfectly for something like this. I can go in and tell it to ignore the white areas again, and to be honest, I'm happy with that already, so I'll just go ahead and click expand. So that's a very quick way of just converting a rough sketch to a vector, which I can now go and adjust. There will still be lots of anchor points if I switch to my direct selection tool, but that is just part and parcel of using this feature. For an example like this that you may want to create a much cleaner design, it's not going to really be usable. We can still do the same thing, go to image trace, black and white logo, and you can see here it's picking up some of the pen strokes, so I would have to go and potentially adjust the threshold again, but that's fairly easy to do. I could take the number of paths down to try and simplify this more, but really it's still a bit all over the place, and really you shouldn't expect anything less. It is a rough sketch at the end of the day. You're not going to get perfectly straight lines, so for something like this you can still vectorize it easily, but if you wanted to create a very precise, sharp, corporate looking logo, really it's not a usable feature for something like that. It's much better for rough, hand-drawn looking sketches. So let's move on to our last example, and this is an instance that probably nearly every designer has experienced at some point, where you've been sent a logo or a graphic from a client and they want to make changes or simply get a larger version of their logo, but all they have is a raster image version of it. So this can happen a lot. We've got an example here of a graphic in a low-res JPEG, and we also have a higher-res PNG. We're going to take a look at both of these examples and how we might go about vectorizing them. So with the first one, let's try our image trace again. So we'll go back to properties, image trace, and we'll go straight in with high fidelity photo on this one. So theoretically that should retain the most amount of detail and colors. In this example we're obviously dealing with a gradient as well, so that's another factor to consider, but as you can see this is simply not doing a good enough job. This looks really messy and no amount of tinkering is going to help this, as I've previously mentioned. So using image trace for something like this is simply not a viable option, especially if it's a low res image. Let's move on to the higher resolution PNG and see if that's any better. So we'll go back to image trace, high fidelity photo, and this will take a little bit longer to resolve, as to be expected. And this has done a much better job, don't get me wrong, but really this still isn't good enough in my opinion. If you're a professional designer and you're handing back something like this, I personally wouldn't be very happy as a client. There's still lots of rough edges, some of the dashed lines look quite rough as well, and if I zoom into the text especially, we've got some strange cornering going on where some corners are very rounded and others are very sharp. And text is definitely something that the image trace feature can struggle with at times, and really your best bet when it comes to vectorizing text is to try and identify the font if you can. There are plenty of good font identifiers online now. Simply do a Google search for font identifier and you'll get quite a few results, and what you can do with them is upload an image and they will give you the closest match to their font libraries, or what you can do is just try and match it as best you can with fonts that you already have or you already have access to. So in this case I would always recommend going for a manual trace. This is a perfect example of utilizing your shape tools as well. So this is all centered around a circle, so I can use my ellipse tool for example and draw out a perfect circle. We've got some simple dashed stroke lines and a fairly simple icon in the middle as well. Now another thing to note is that we have this gradient, and when you use the image trace feature on a gradient, it's not actually going to create a gradient for you. What's actually happening is this is creating bands of color instead. If I zoom right in here, you'll see this slightly more clearly, and this just is not good enough as well. This is not going to reproduce very well. We want to actually have a proper gradient being created. So what I'm going to do is go back to my layers, we'll lock this images layer again, and if I turn on my trace example layer again, we've created a trace over this. Again, simply using the pen tool to do so. So we've recreated this simple icon in the middle. This is much cleaner. So are the dashed lines, and I'm using a clipping mask to make sure all of this has been contained within this circle. If I double click into the clipping mask, we have this circle here, and this actually has a proper gradient being applied to it. I also have text on a path set up, and what this also means is that if the client ever wanted to make updates or change the font, we actually have editable text here that we can change this with complete ease as well. If I go to my outline view again, let's double click into here and you can see just how simple all of these paths are. Minimal anchor points, nice and easy to edit, and generally this is a much better outcome than if we were to have used the image trace feature. So there you have it for our overview on the best ways to convert an image into a vector design in 2021. The image trace feature definitely still has some uses for sure, but if you're wanting to create truly professional and usable designs, tracing them with the likes of the pen tool, your shape tools, is always going to produce a much cleaner outcome. Hopefully you found this useful though, and do let us know if you have any questions in the comments down below. Okay guys, I'll see you in the next one. If you want to learn more about graphic design, we've put together a free 1-hour training where you'll discover the top 5 secrets of successful designers, which saves you the hassle of trying to figure it all out for yourself. We'll be showing you how to immerse yourself in the sector you're designing for, creative thinking and how to spark creativity, what good composition is and how you can achieve it in your designs, how to pick the right colours for your designs, and how to pick the right typefaces for your projects. So if you're serious about leveling up as a graphic designer, then make sure to sign up for the next free webinar. Space is limited and these events always fill up fast because they're significantly better than the information others charge you for, and ours is free. The link's in the description, you're not going to want to miss it. I'll see you there.